The psychology behind an empath becoming avoidant. Have you ever noticed how some of the most loving people eventually become the most emotionally distant? How someone who once gave endless chances suddenly stops explaining themselves and starts walking away without looking back? Many people assume that avoidant behavior is something a person is born with. But sometimes avoidance is not the beginning of someone's story, it is the ending of years of emotional exhaustion. This is especially true for empaths. People who naturally feel deeply connect deeply and often care about others even more than they care about themselves. The psychology behind an empath becoming avoidant is not about becoming cold. It is about what happens when a warm heart experiences too much pain without enough safety. An empath does not usually start life avoiding connection. In fact, they often spend years chasing connection, understanding people, and trying to heal relationships that are already falling apart. They believe communication can solve almost anything. They believe love can overcome distance, misunderstanding, and emotional walls. When conflict happens, they usually move closer instead of farther away. They ask questions, seek understanding, and try to repair the emotional damage before it grows larger. But over time, something begins to change. Not because they stop caring, but because caring starts costing them more than they can afford emotionally. The first stage of this transformation often begins with repeated disappointment. The empath keeps showing up emotionally while receiving very little emotional investment in return. They listen when others are struggling. They support people through difficult moments and offer patience that many people would never give. Yet when they need support themselves, the same effort is often missing. The relationship slowly becomes a one-way street where giving feels expected and receiving feels impossible. At first, the empath makes excuses for this imbalance. They tell themselves the other person is stressed, busy, confused, or emotionally wounded. Because empaths naturally see potential in people, they often focus more on who someone could become than who that person consistently chooses to be. This creates a dangerous cycle. The empath keeps investing emotionally, while the relationship keeps draining emotional energy without replenishing it. Months turn into years, and what once felt like compassion slowly begins to feel like emotional survival. The second stage happens when the empath realizes that understanding someone does not necessarily protect them from being hurt by that person. This realization changes everything. For years, they believed empathy was the solution. They believed that if they could understand the pain behind someone's behavior, then the relationship could improve. But eventually, they discover a difficult truth. Understanding why someone hurts you does not make the hurt disappear. Knowing someone's childhood wounds does not erase broken promises. Knowing someone's fears does not remove the consequences of their actions. This realization creates emotional conflict inside the empath, because their natural instinct is still to understand while another part of them is becoming exhausted. For the first time, they begin questioning whether endless compassion is actually helping anyone, and that question becomes the beginning of emotional withdrawal. The third stage is where emotional burnout appears. This is the stage most people never recognize until it is already happening. The empath becomes tired of explaining the same feelings repeatedly. They become tired of having conversations that never lead to meaningful change. They become tired of being the emotional leader in every relationship. And eventually they become tired of hoping. Hope is powerful when it is supported by action. But hope becomes painful when it survives longer than reality. At this point, something inside the empath starts shutting down. Not because they want revenge, but because their mind is trying to protect itself. Psychologically, this is known as a protective adaptation. The brain begins reducing emotional investment in situations that repeatedly create pain. What once felt like openness starts turning into caution. What once felt like vulnerability starts turning into emotional distance. And this is where many people become confused. Because from the outside, it suddenly looks like the empath has become avoidant. But internally, something very different is happening. They are not running from intimacy itself. They are running from the expectation that intimacy will once again require them to sacrifice themselves. They are protecting their energy from patterns that have repeatedly caused emotional damage. The fourth stage involves emotional boundaries becoming stronger. This is often mistaken for coldness by people who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries. The empath stops chasing. They stop over-explaining and stop trying to rescue every struggling relationship. They begin paying attention to actions instead of promises. And they become far less willing to carry emotional responsibility for other people's choices. To those who were accustomed to unlimited access, this feels shocking. The empath who once tolerated everything now walks away from situations that disrespect them. The empath who once begged for communication now becomes comfortable with silence, because they have finally learned that forcing connection rarely creates genuine connection. Psychologically, this shift represents growth, but it can also resemble avoidant behavior when viewed from the outside. The difference is motivation. Traditional avoidance often comes from fear of emotional closeness. An empath who becomes avoidant is often reacting to accumulated emotional injuries. Their distance is not caused by fear of love, but by fear of losing themselves again. This distinction matters greatly, because the empath still wants connection deep down. They still desire intimacy, trust, and emotional safety. What they no longer desire is one-sided emotional labor. They no longer want relationships where they are expected to carry all the emotional weight. And they no longer believe love requires self-abandonment. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where peace becomes more valuable than potential. This is one of the biggest psychological shifts they will ever experience. In the past, they were attracted to possibilities. Now they are attracted to consistency. In the past, they focused on who someone might become. Now they focus on who that person repeatedly shows themselves to be. This change can make the empath appear detached, but often they are simply becoming realistic. They are no longer willing to ignore red flags in the name of understanding, and they are no longer willing to sacrifice their emotional health for someone else's comfort. The most surprising part of this transformation is that many empaths do not even realize it is happening. They simply wake up one day and notice they no longer have the energy to chase what keeps running away. The relationship patterns that once consumed their attention begin losing power over them. The people who once controlled their emotions suddenly have less influence. And for the first time in years, they start choosing themselves. Not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. The psychology behind an empath becoming avoidant is ultimately a story of adaptation. It is what happens when a heart that spent years giving finally learns the value of protecting itself. Because after enough disappointment, the empath stops asking how to save the relationship and starts asking how to save their own peace. And that moment changes everything. Because once an empath learns that self-preservation is not selfish, they rarely return to the version of themselves that tolerated emotional neglect in the name of love.